This lecture is meant to unpack the key ideas that surround the school of thought in international relations theory known as constructivism. It's also a lecture that seeks to connect a lot of the core ideas in constructivism to the works of the 20th century painter Irving Norman. Just to start things off, what is constructivism? Constructivism is an interesting but somewhat complex topic around why the international system in our world exists in the form that it does. And it's also an idea that's better understood if you first go back and understand some of the older theories of international relations known as realism and liberalism. I have 2 talks on those topics I recommend listening to first before approaching this one. With that in mind, let's put together a definition of constructivism. As said earlier, to understand constructivism, it's first really helpful to understand realism and liberalism, which I will attempt to briefly define now. So realism is a school of thought about international relations that started in somewhat Enlightenment era Europe, which asserts the idea that the primary actor in international affairs is a political state, as defined by a country led by a coherent government. And those countries then seek to maximize their own power relative to other ones in an effort to survive and maintain the preservation of their state. And the way they do that is to form alliances, go to war, and do anything they can to protect themselves from potential threats from their neighbors. If you were to put it really crudely, as the ancient Romans did, the best way to sum up realism might be the phrase, if you want peace, prepare for war. The best defense is to some degree a good offense. Power is a great measure of your security because if your neighbor has a lot of power, that takes a long time to build up, but their intention on how they could use it could change overnight. So it's a conservative, somewhat pragmatic, but also somewhat violent approach to the international system. Now, that contrasts with an Enlightenment idea, the other tenet of international relations theory that gets a lot of credit, which is liberalism, something that's seen much of its success under the reign of America as the primary superpower in the world, which is the idea that individuals fundamentally desire and pursue freedom and prosperity, and that the international system should be one where the pursuit of cooperation is the supreme organizer of countries' efforts. How that cooperation is defined gets a little less clear, but it's somewhat explained in the idea that accompanies liberalism, that is democratic peace theory, which is the idea that countries are much more likely to be prosperous and protect individual liberties and be able to cooperate in ways that prevent war if they are fundamentally democratic societies, where people have some say over who is governing them. Beyond the ideas of just democracy, other examples of liberalism playing out in institutions would include the EU, the IMF, the World Bank, NATO, really any international body that encourages global stability through some form of international cooperation, or very important here, interdependency between nations. So the idea is if you're doing a lot of economic trade or if you have a lot of institutional cooperation between different countries, they have a significantly lower incentive to pursue their interests in the form of military conflict. Both realism and liberalism have, with a great amount of success, been able to explain numerous historical events where wars broke out, changes in the international system happened, countries took form, and major economic or social events changed the direction of entire societies. But one major event that the schools of thought surrounding realism and liberalism failed to predict was the absolute, utter, and complete disintegration of the Soviet Union. In the 30 years that have followed the fall of communism and the end of the Soviet Union, there has also been little success from realism and liberalism as frameworks for explaining why that happened. And this is why, in the year 1989, as the Soviet Union was really falling apart, the international relations theory of constructivism came into the light of day. So constructivism, as its name implies, is the idea that the norms and behaviors of our international system are ones that are actually socially constructed, and that there are no real ultimate truths that we can totally rely on for predicting behavior, as is the case with realist theory on the basis of the pursuit of power, or liberalism on the vague pursuit of liberty. So if we stick with our Cold War example for now, just to give some sort of weight to constructivism, the Cold War is one example of a war that can be described a couple of different ways. That struggle between the United States and its system and the Russian-led Soviet Union and its system. Realism, vaguely speaking, sums up the struggle of the Cold War as one where both sides, in pursuit of peace, prepared for war. This is the mutually assured destruction idea in the Cold War, where both America and the Russians pursued nukes, huge advances in aerospace, technology, and a host of other military and economic chess moves in order to be a formidable threat to the other. And that this threat of annihilation actually somewhat constrained them to behave better, which sounds pretty good. As we all know, though, there were consequences of that power struggle on the lives of hundreds of millions of people around the globe that were quite negative, and realism doesn't really even try to address why and how those issues played out. Liberalism, at the very least, asserts the idea that there is a struggle for liberty and freedom that is sort of the natural state of mankind. So human beings, in the pursuit of their own personal freedom and sovereignty, are ultimately going to end up like the liberal democracies of Western Europe, the United States, Australia, Japan, South Korea, the countries that cooperated with the United States during the Cold War. And that, U.S. power is neither here nor there the most important part. This is a natural state that human beings want to have. They want their freedom, they want their prosperity, and they will have it as long as some dark, evil force like fascism or communism does not get in the way. Now, you would think if you were a scholar of liberal thinking, you would almost not be worried about the Soviet Union, just on the notion that if their system is so flawed and different from what you see as the natural state of mankind, isn't it doomed from the start? Now, you would think that that was the approach people had, but quite the contrary. It was actually many liberals in the United States government and around the world who were most paranoid about the Soviet Union and made some of the most militarily and economically egregious blunders while trying to combat it. Ideas like domino theory or perceptions of the behaviors of different countries around the world that were just totally off the mark were in part because liberalism could not understand the motivations and the cultural identities of many of the countries that were under a communist banner. They just saw them all as not the liberal model and therefore a threat. Maybe the most famous example is the Vietnam War, where domino theory implied that the Vietnamese, upon becoming communist, would join with the Russians and the Chinese, a country that invaded Vietnam so many times throughout history that even the leadership of the Viet Cong at that time found the idea that just because they assumed a communist banner that they would join with China to be laughable. It also almost goes without saying that many of the ideas surrounding liberalism and the way it gets pursued face constant accusations of hypocrisy because of the fact that, as we all know, during the Cold War, many countries allied with the quote-unquote free world were hardly free. They were puppet states, dictatorships, or things that would certainly contradict the philosophical natural state of mankind as asserted by many a liberal thinker. So, enter constructivism, a school of thought that immediately has quite a lot of baggage to handle. It has to deal with the fact that realism wasn't able to see the flaws in the Soviet system that undermined its ultimate pursuit of power. And it had to look at the liberal system and see how its failure to classify different ways of thinking and perceiving the world just severely hampered any coherent ability to predict the behaviors, interests, or perceptions of these many different kinds of countries that were, at least at that time, assuming a communist banner under the Soviet alliance. So it is perhaps without surprise that leading constructivist thinkers then and now have been most interested in exploring the means with which we construct identities that lead to consequential actions in society, in different countries, as well as within and among the institutions that facilitate modern-day international trade, defense, and diplomacy. Constructivists do concede, like realists do, however, that the international system is essentially in an anarchistic state because there's no authority above the authority of governments and the agreements between them. So the state is still a primary actor in constructivism. But where realists say that anarchy creates a scramble for power, constructivists, particularly the constructivist Alexander Wendt, is famous for saying, anarchy is what states make of it. Now, what does that mean exactly? That means that even if I am in a situation where there is a struggle for power, like a realist would describe it, or even a situation where there's international cooperation and trade, like with liberalism, it's still perceived that you are a rational actor pursuing rational interests by rational means. A constructivist is not so sure. And in an era where just in the popular conversation we are becoming increasingly aware of our own capacity to be manipulated by marketing, by social media, you name it, there's something that is familiar about constructivism because it kind of asserts in some indirect ways that perhaps we are not rational actors and that we don't pursue our interests always by rational means. Or we at least don't do it often enough for it to be well worth considering as we try to understand what forces dictate the direction of diplomacy, trade, and statecraft. So constructivists ask themselves, what causes a state to act in a certain way? And additionally, constructivists believe that states develop ideas and institutions to manage relations between other states. So one example of a constructivist scholar would be Nicholas Wheeler from the University of Birmingham, and he's interested in ideas such as fear, cooperation, and trust, and how those emotions or those perceptions of those concepts actually can dictate the nature of diplomacy. Let's go back to our US-Russia paradigm as an example. So in the aftermath of the Cold War, there was an expectation among many liberals, for example, that Russia and the Eastern Bloc would essentially join the liberal international order of the US and Western Europe with America at the helm, and that you would get a pretty unified world. There were writers like Francis Fukuyama, who wrote The End of History, and even postulated that we might be bored one day from the harmonious liberal institutions that become exceedingly more powerful in our world. As we all know, now in 2021, the relationship between the United States and the core state of the Soviet Union, the Russian Federation, has in some ways, but not all, really kind of returned to many of the norms that it had during the Cold War. Now, there have been radical changes in the economic sphere, sure, and it's no longer a communist state, but certainly old identities interfered with a lot of what maybe otherwise could have been possible in the Russian world and its ability to cooperate with Western Europe and the United States. Additionally, the way Western Europeans and Americans see themselves now and saw themselves at the end of the Cold War definitely played a role in why the end of the Cold War and the transition to democratic capitalism roughly in the Eastern Bloc has been a very mixed bag and not one of absolute liberal hegemony by any extent of the imagination. So already in the post-Cold War period, we can see evidence of how a country's perception of itself and its perception of other countries relative to each other can drastically influence the direction of an entire region of the world's destiny. If you're really interested in this topic, I highly suggest a book written by Peter Conradi called Who Lost Russia? How the World Entered a New Cold War, which really digs into a series of critical events between the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of communism, and roughly up through the 2016 election, which shows how, in many cases, the way both the United States and Russia perceived each other and how they perceived themselves and their roles in the world in ways that clashed with what might have been necessary on both sides to have changed in order to have a more peaceful and harmonious relationship today. So, in summary, constructivism really puts forward this idea that states act according to their identity on the international stage, and that this identity helps us predict the behavior of those states. Using our post-Cold War example, if you as a Russian see yourself as a superpower or as the citizen of a superpower which demands a sort of disproportionate level of respect in the world, you struggle to maybe make certain concessions or to trust certain institutions in times of economic hardship and in times when the direction of the country is uncertain. Conversely, if you are from the United States and you perceive your country to be a superpower which demands a disproportionate amount of respect in the world, and you hit difficult economic times, or you meet with other countries that expect a similar superpower treatment, you are also, by that identity, unlikely to trust certain institutions, certain actions by the government, and certain outcomes on the international stage. And this is where constructivism gets kind of complicated, because although it is great at explaining the shortcomings of previous approaches to tackling the complicated world of international affairs, in the pursuit of what leads individuals, citizenries, and the countries that they make up to have a certain identity, and then to prove that that identity is having a direct impact on a certain policy decision or other maneuver, you run into a lot of question marks. Now, there's a lot of constructivist literature that you can look into, but I think it's difficult to crystallize a lot of the ideas in constructivism and make coherent a lot of the identities that constructivism is tackling without eventually and inevitably entering the world of art. I think the risk, if you don't bring art into your constructivist worldview, is you put at risk many of the good things about constructivism, and you enter what is often known in the academic sphere as critical constructivism. Now, critical constructivism is a lot like the conventional constructivism I've been describing, but it is less interested in the identities of states or their behavior, and they are more interested in the components of identity itself. So it starts with how we use language to decide things, and how language can predefine a lot of ideas for us in almost an automatic sense, and where we create distortions in our thinking. So this is where you enter a world of what some would call political correctness, or movements to change language in ways where there is less bias, such as the gendered articles in many languages like Spanish, French, or German. It also enters a space where you get a lot of constructivists who are inspired by postmodernist philosophers such as Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault, who, granted, do have a great artful skill at pointing out biases in our society, Foucault being a homosexual who was interested in many of the things that underlied prejudices against minority groups, and Jacques Derrida, who, as an Algerian Jew during the Second World War, had a great interest in answering the question of why fascism effectively rose up in Germany and was so built around this idea of putting down certain groups of people and ultimately exterminating them. So those ideas, although I think worth pursuing, I don't think do give a complete picture of how you can predict state behavior on their own. Even if you deconstruct language, even if you examine the world of words to its most abstract degree, it is very difficult to translate that into clumsier behaviors in the real world that ultimately result in maybe a practical application of your theory. So I would say that although there is a place for that postmodern set of thinking, it can sometimes lead down a rabbit hole if you're not careful of more questions than answers, and you kind of can get trapped in this intellectual block of everything is subjective, everything is just in the eye of the beholder, everything is just sort of a matter of circumstance and taste. I really want to advise against that way of thinking, and I think art is a good way to do that because art does not play with language, which most people in the world of critical constructivism or postmodernist thinking sometimes go for. Art deals in a world of symbols, themes, and just almost like pictogram-like ideas. As we know from ancient people, going back to the first cave paintings, we have had visual art for a lot longer than we have had complex written language, and maybe even complex spoken language. Now, for the record, I am no linguist, and I am not at all saying that there is not substantial evidence from a lot of talented linguists that your worldview is certainly affected by the structure of your language and how it's spoken and how it's written. I only want to put forward the idea that if what you're interested in doing is understanding the world at large, how countries form, how we make decisions as larger political bodies and as countries, in my humble opinion, it's better as a starting point to look at base level symbolism as depicted in images, not in language. I believe that imagery informs the language, and even if language has a filtering aspect to it that leads to certain changes in perception, such as some languages like German have words like Schadenfreude or Torschlusspanik that don't exist in the same way in English or other languages, and that can alter perception and awareness of certain concepts and ideas, I still think that those ideas get crystallized first as an image and then as a word. So just to be totally clear, that is my reasoning for why imagery and symbolism is for me a more effective starting point on the topic of constructivism and understanding its place in international relations than digging into the many different lingual structures that dictate languages around the world. I think this is supported by the fact that a lot of people who are in the spheres of critical constructivism and who look at postmodern philosophy more generally are typically not the most interested people in predicting the behavior of political states. I want to make the point, though, that both the conventional and the critical constructivist are interested in ontology and how we form core ideas about existence and being and reality. And when you look at the fact that we construct identities around what we understand or believe about existence, being, and reality, I don't think that conversation is possible without art as a coherent reference point. And just as images precede language, the language of constructivism and its origins in 1989 don't start for me in 1989 at the end of the Cold War, but with a man who died in the year 1989. And that man is an artist named Irving Norman. Irving Norman was born Irving Noashevitz in what is modern-day Lithuania in the city of Vilnius in 1906, and then immigrated to the United States at the age of 17, where he would live for the rest of his life. Like many immigrants, he started in New York City, but unlike many immigrants who were astounded by the size, scale, and economic activity of New York, he was somewhat horrified initially by the gross levels of excess, intensity, wealth, poverty, and the like. And this was something that had a huge impact on how he saw people, countries, and the role of art itself in making people aware of different identities and different possibilities. By 1923, he moved to Laguna Beach, California, a long-standing art colony which really picked up some steam as an artist haven in the 60s. But at the time, he worked as a barber. He had not yet developed his great artistic works that would happen later in life. And he lived there for about 4 years. Now, I actually don't know the fine details of what his politics were. I know from some research that in his youth he flirted with some ideas around communism, and it's generally clear that many of the excesses created in a market economy did particularly disturb and bother him. At least in my retelling of his life and his art, I would encourage you not to think too much about his particular politics, but really how his worldview was constructed by events and how his worldview is expressed in his art. And especially how his art expresses a sense that we can construct a different world if we so choose. We do know that Irving Norman also, to some degree, put his money where his mouth was and did go to fight in Spain in the last year of the Spanish Civil War, trying to fight against the forces of the fascist dictator Franco. The PTSD he suffered from the things he saw and did during that time haunted him for the rest of his life, and like those great, massive metropolis scenes of inequality that affected his youth when he moved to New York City, the scenes of terror in a war zone had a profound impact on his artwork and how he perceived the forces that lead people to make war and make money. Many of those images can be seen in a book very appropriately titled Dark Metropolis, which shows a wide range of oil paintings and drawings made by Irving Norman, who was prolifically active for decades leading up to his death. Irving Norman was not a particularly famous or particularly recognized artist during his time. When he got done with his stint in Spain, he returned to California, this time more around Catalina Island and then the San Francisco Bay Area. And it was around this time in his life where these images of economic hardship and also the horrors of war converged to create something that is really a visual construction of his worldview. Now, in my lecture about liberalism, I made the point that the paintings by the abstract artist Jackson Pollock, with its many blotches of paint and swirls of indistinguishable color, were a very useful metaphor for the connections and the subjective desires of liberalism because of its flexibility and indefinability in terms of any single human being's internal reality or raw passions or raw desires. I think the antithesis to a Jackson Pollock would be an Irving Norman painting where the imagery is very specific, very closely and carefully rendered, and very meticulously cultivated. If Jackson Pollock's many paintings, and drip paintings particularly, his most abstract, are looked at through the lens of political liberalism, then we see a world where freedom in its most abstract and raw form is depicted on a canvas where a man is literally just flailing paint at a canvas. And upon that very simple, yet also complicatedly messy artifice, one can project their own subjective desires and freedoms and see a base motivation to pursue them. Irving Norman was interested in none of that. Irving Norman had legitimate images in his head from real lived experience that he wanted to bring out in a hyper-real, metaphoric, often hellscape that was meant to really look at the perceptions, ideas, and powers that came together to create our human world and really point out many of their shortcomings. If Jackson Pollock is the cowboy-esque paint slinger acting on a whim or acting on just a raw, almost automatic base set of aims and desires, Irving Norman is the premeditated, self-aware, and I would argue stronger template for a truly free, self-aware individual, regardless of what you think about his particular set of beliefs. I also point out in my lecture about liberalism that Jackson Pollock's painting, as it was used in the American media ecosystem to promote the ideas of liberalism, that pursuit of freedom, unwittingly, in some ways, unveils the erroneous and erratic forces that sometimes dictate how we currently, in our modern world, perceive freedom. And that irrational flinging of feelings and ideas does not always produce a political environment that feels like one that is conducive to freedom, and worse yet, in some cases seems to act against it by exploiting those raw emotions and desires. And this brings me to a painting which I suggest you look up, which is called Meeting of the Elders. Meeting of the Elders is an oil painting painted in 1977. And it depicts a scene of what we can infer to be something of a boardroom where there are about 12 or so men seated at a table, but they are fastened down in chairs made out of what appear to be gold and copper coins. Now, what's so interesting about this particular painting is the scene with which it's dropped in. You have middle-aged to elderly-looking men who look somewhat frail and somewhat out of shape, and they are not just seated in gold chairs, but they really are in chairs that seem to have them bolted in by the coins that comprise their bodies. Additionally, you have in the background sashes and these strange banners that, when you look closely, seem to generally resemble corporate metrics such as bar graphs or pie charts or burn down charts of some kind, but they are reimagined almost as banners that you would drape over a building like the Vatican or in some sort of religious space. The men are also decorated in a room that is full of coins that have been put on the wall. On the left side, you can see what appear to be somewhat indigenous sculptures of what look like works of art that could have come from parts of Africa or Pacific Islands, perhaps even an Aboriginal area. And below those figures are sarcophaguses of what appear to be mummified, gray, frail bodies. But they're kind of peripherally to the left. The central focus of the entire thing is this table that somewhat resents a corporate boardroom with what appear to be papers, notes, a couple of drinks, a book or two on the table, and these frail men bolted into their chairs that are literally made of money. Now, there's one man at the head of the table who has a couple of key features that are unique to him. He not only is at the head of the table putting forward his importance, but he is, although still bolted to the money chair, the only man in the picture who has an arm that is not also bolted down to the coin. So his right arm is extending and raising his hand to a point as if he is exclaiming something very important to the others who appear to be just quietly listening. Now, it is interesting to me that the most expressive person is clearly the person of the greatest importance at the table, and he is also the only person with the freedom of his right arm to move around, while all of the others appear bolted in to the chairs, except with just enough desk space to scribble down some notes as he speaks. Now, while the situation of these men who are sort of our pseudo-symbolic corporate board members are not appearing to have a very good time, they have grayish kind of skin, they appear to be suffering, they don't have full control of their limbs or even have the ability to sit up because they are seated in these gold coin chairs, they do appear better off than what is placed directly underneath their chairs and table, which is a series of rugs, which, as we look closely, look to be made up of human bodies that have been flattened. And they're not rugs at all. They're almost more like two-dimensional corpses. That is, except for the three-dimensional human heads of varying colors and sizes that are connected to the flattened bodies. Now, it's vague, but you get a sense that these bodies on the ground are maybe of a more ethnically diverse background, as some seem to have different skin tones, even if those skin tones are blue, green, purple, and a bright pink that no human really has. They are not like the gray, monochromatic old men sitting in their coin chairs in the boardroom. Now, I've described a lot of symbols here. There's symbols of money, there's symbols of colonialism, there's symbols of power, there's symbols of just outright genocide in some degree. If you're going to place a sarcophagus below what appears to be an African statue next to men literally draped in gold, you're sending a message. And I don't really want to get into any specificities of, once again, the politics of Irving Norman, but I want to get into the identities that are constructed deliberately through his self-aware actions as an artist and what they are implying about the decisions that govern our world. Now, it doesn't take a whole lot of intellect to realize Irving Norman is not a fan of corporate structures, excessive amounts of money, or inequality. I think what's also worth pointing out about Irving Norman is he is juxtaposing this scene of opulence with a scene of constrained freedom. Although it's clearly looking like a much more deadly scene to be one of the dead, rugged people on the ground who are laid out like just decoration, it also looks outright torturous to be one of the board members who are very obviously and metaphorically constrained by the forces of money, in this case, literal coins that are restricting their actions. So I don't want to turn this into a kind of cliche expression of the market economy where we talk about not just, the evil corporation here. In this painting, I think what's worth pointing out is although the plight of most people on Earth, as embodied by the heterogeneous rugs, is evidence, it sucks to be in that state. But Norman is pointing out also that the board members are suffering as well. The people who are putting together this system are suffering. And they are suffering in large part because of how they are using money, which ties us back to constructivism. Constructivism, like art, asserts that the ideational world is as important as the material one, and the material world can't tell us everything about people and everything that we believe, and it can't tell us about how we perceive the actions that we will take next. But the internal world and our perceptions of our outer world based on our internal world is something that is very clearly articulated through great works of art. And belief is expressed through art, and belief is something Norman believes really crystallizes in art. He himself, during his life, referring to art museums as the modern-day cathedrals. So he believes that he is working in a space where belief takes form. He's not just creating propaganda. He's not cynical. He is trying to create a genesis of belief about the world and what is possible within it and where its constraints are, very much like a constructivist. If a constructivist is attacking realism, they are going to say that it is the perception that the world is a power game and that the best defense is a good offense that is driving the negative forces of war and conflict in our world. And if a constructivist is correct about that, it means realism is creating more problems than it solves. If a constructivist is attacking liberalism, they are going to say your belief in economic cooperation or a particular kind of political structure in your state and your absolute trust in that as a dictating force is going to impact your behavior. And the shortcomings of your behavior are evident in your perception of what the world is. You might justify gross inequality if you see it as part of the interconnectivity between countries that prevents war. You would be less likely to question certain moneyed institutions if they are seen as integral to the international system and its stability. Just like you would be less likely to question the buildup of military arms if you see them as an essential part of defending your country from state actors that you cannot trust. Now, it doesn't mean to say that realism and liberalism are incorrect in making these assumptions, but a constructivist would argue that these ideas in realism and liberalism were constructed as a way of tackling the needs of the international systems that birthed those ideas. That is a terrifying and a beautiful idea at the same time. On one hand, it means there's something that's inherently untrue about the principles of those theories. On the other hand, it means a new set of circumstances or a new way of perceiving oneself as a person or a nation or an international body could lead to a different way of doing things and possibly a better one. And that gets me back to those gold coins that those men are bolted to in Irving Norman's paintings. It can be easy to look at that scene of suffering, constraints, and mausoleum-like death in the meeting of the elders as a pessimistic painting. But when you know that its creator is a believer in art and its capacity to shape belief towards better outcomes, you can interpret it in a totally different way. By understanding on the level of imagery that money constrains your actions, that money traps you in a spot where you're possibly harming others, or at the very least, more broadly, a certain way of looking at economics does that, then you are able to consider other ideas. Granted, I don't think Irving Norman is necessarily saying all money is bad, but that money as a concept has constraints that can lead to unquestioned actions that can cause harm. And for Irving Norman, this is summed up in his very prolific quote, "Timidity has never produced great art or great museums." He's a guy trying to make a bold statement about the shortcomings he can see within his time in order to make something better. That's why I want us to focus on that theme within his art, because whatever he believes about that, he has not devoted himself to a specific political cause and created art around it as one might for a propaganda poster for a political state. What he's doing is advocating a capacity to identify the structures that cause us to believe and perceive and act in certain ways, and at least come to the conclusion that maybe they can at least be improved. Constructivists would agree with Irving Norman because they often equate the international system to how we behave around money. So money, as is famously pointed out by scholars like Nicholas Wheeler, or just by, anybody who's, seen a few too many bright stars at a music festival, money is something we invented, right? Money has no inherent value beyond what we ascribe to it. And it's through, as the other constructivist thinker Alexander Wendt points out, this series of mutual agreements, norms, and rules that make up the way we conduct our affairs and what things we put trust in. Essentially, money is valuable because we agree that it has a certain value. Bitcoin is sometimes really valuable and sometimes not very valuable because, at least collectively, we agree that that is the case. The international system is a struggle for power to the extent that we agree it is. The international system is a space for cooperation and trade to the extent that we agree together that it is. And that is based on underlying perceptions of what is possible or what is right. What art, in the form of paintings like Irving Norman's, can do is at least invite us to revisit those underlying symbols and images that shape our mutual agreements. In the world of international affairs, where we look at concepts a little more fine-grained than just something like money, this means also studying the protocols, perceptions, and general behaviors at organizations, particularly powerful organizations that can have a huge effect on the rest of our world. The financial system and its game of perception, the militaries of different countries and their various institutional procedures, the belief systems that make up the bedrock of different governmental structures. It's all on the table, and the accepted behaviors, norms, and expectations at different institutions is what aggregates to make up what we construct to be the international system. Now, I think at this point it's worth pointing out that there is a downside to constructivism we haven't gotten to yet, which is the idea that, okay, if everything is just a social construct, like, why believe anything? How is this not excessively bleak? If we're just tearing down and deconstructing the way things are done, what is the point? If we're just kind of always ending up that it's all bullshit and it's all what we believe. I think the answer to that has two parts. One, if we go back to our money example, being aware that money is a construct socially agreed upon by human beings doesn't necessarily dismiss it as something that we shouldn't have. Money can be very useful. That being said, the application of that belief system, or ways to fine-tune it, or just a re-examination of what is not working about it, has the potential to lead to better outcomes if we put our mind to it. I also think that's the importance of art in this discussion. Nobody spends, or next to nobody spends, hundreds of hours on an oil painting because they think expressing it has no point. Anybody who's worked on an oil painting knows that firsthand. And what I would like to conclude about constructivism, as well as art's role in constructing the symbols and images that dictate our beliefs and our mutual agreements, norms, and rules, is that there is a capacity in art to remind us on a visceral level why looking at these things is worthwhile. It's because we are not beholden to the words and ideas of the past in their entirety. We are beholden to the images we have in our head of the world that we can perceive. And if we are able to re-examine those images, rearrange them, and repurpose them in the context of what we can see out there in the world, we have the potential to make a better world, and one that's not done in a relativistic, pessimistic way, but in one that comes from a fixed, very aware, symbolically literate point of view. And that is what I think is the beauty of constructivism. On the short end of the stick, you disassemble a lot of things people hold dear. But on the positive side, when it's augmented properly with the symbolism of art, you can look at it through a lens that can allow you to actionably believe that better days are ahead and better things are possible. We are better off staring the complexity of the world in the face and working to engage with it than we are ascribing to a specific linear principle whenever possible. Or, as I would like to conclude, in the words of Irving Norman, real great works of art are not simple.